It was an ordinary Tuesday afternoon when my 5-year-old son Nathan came running up to me. I was sitting on the couch working from home while keeping an eye on him. I looked up, smiling, expecting him to ask for a snack or help with his toys. Instead, he said something that froze me in place. "Daddy, why was Mommy and a man wrestling in the bedroom?" My heart dropped into my stomach. I laughed nervously, ruffling his hair, trying to dismiss it as a child's confusion. "What do you mean, buddy?" His face was so innocent, those big blue eyes blinking up at me. "I saw them, Daddy. Mommy told me not to tell anyone." Suddenly, everything in the room felt wrong. The air was thick, and my hands felt cold as I stood up, trying to stay calm. "Stay here, Nathan. I'm just going to check on Mommy, okay?" My voice was steady, but inside, I was crumbling. I walked upstairs, each step feeling heavier than the last. When I reached the bedroom door, I could hear voices, a man's low murmur and my wife's soft laughter. My hands shook as I opened the door. There they were. My wife, Lisa, and her boss, Greg, tangled up on our bed, laughing like they didn't have a care in the world. They didn't notice me at first, and for a moment I was paralyzed. I felt like I'd stepped into someone else's nightmare. When they finally looked up, their laughter died. Lisa's eyes went wide with shock, but Greg just smirked as if he had nothing to lose. He got up slowly, adjusting his shirt like this was just another day at the office. "Well, this is awkward," he said, voice dripping with condescension. "Looks like you walked in at a bad time, pal." I stood there, fists clenched, struggling to keep my voice from shaking. "Get out!" Greg didn't move. Instead, he gave me that same smug grin I'd seen 100 times at company parties. "What are you going to do about it? You don't seriously think she still respects you, do you? You're just convenient." Those words hit me like a punch to the gut. I turned to Lisa, waiting for her to say something, anything, to make this right. But she just stood there, staring at the floor, silent. "Lisa," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Is this true? Is this who you really are?" She didn't answer. Greg laughed. "Why don't you be a man and just walk away? Let her be with someone who can actually make her happy." That was it. I wanted to tear him apart. Every fiber of my being screamed for me to hit him, to make him feel even a fraction of the pain coursing through me. But I didn't. I wasn't going to stoop to his level. Instead, I made a promise to myself. I was going to make sure this man paid. Not with fists, but with something much worse. His smugness, his arrogance, they would be his undoing. Without another word, I turned and walked out of the room, my heart in pieces. I stormed downstairs, my heart racing. Nathan was still sitting on the couch, playing with his toys like nothing had happened. I couldn't let him see me like this, not with my world crumbling around me. "Daddy's going to take a quick walk, okay, buddy?" I forced a smile and grabbed my keys. I needed air. I needed to think. As I stepped outside, the cool breeze hit my face, but it did nothing to calm the storm brewing inside me. My wife, the woman I had loved for 10 years, had betrayed me with a man I despised. Her boss, Greg. The way he looked at me, like I was less than him, like I was nothing. It made my blood boil. I knew Greg. He ran his company like he was untouchable. He made sure everyone knew he was the top dog, with his expensive suits and his charm that fooled everyone but me. I always had this gut feeling about him, but I pushed it aside, trusting Lisa. And now, here I was, feeling like a fool forever thinking she could be different. As I walked down the street, replaying everything in my mind, I felt a wave of shame crash over me. How long had this been going on? How many times had she looked me in the eye, lied to me, and then gone back to him? Every late night at work, every missed dinner. It all made sense now. I kicked a rock on the sidewalk and clenched my fists. I wasn't just angry. I was humiliated. Humiliated by the man who thought he could take what was mine, and by the woman I had trusted with my entire life. But I wasn't going to let this destroy me. If Greg thought he could humiliate me and walk away unscathed, he was dead wrong. I wasn't going to fight him physically. No. That's what he expected. I was going to hit him where it hurt. His precious company, his career, everything he built his identity on, I was going to tear it down. I pulled out my phone and did something I never thought I'd do. I called my brother, Nick. He was a lawyer, the kind of guy who knew exactly how to deal with scum like Greg. We weren't close, but right now, I needed someone who could help me see this through. The phone rang twice before Nick picked up. "What's up, man?" "You never call," he said, his voice light and teasing. "Nick, I need your help," I said, my voice breaking a little. "Lisa's been cheating on me, with her boss." There was silence on the other end for a moment before Nick responded, his voice turning serious. "What? Are you serious?" "Dead serious. I just walked in on them. I need to figure out how to take this guy down, but legally. I can't let him win, Nick." He didn't hesitate. "All right, listen. If this guy's her boss, there might be some legal grounds to work with. I've dealt with corporate cases like this before. We can dig into his business, find any dirt. But first, you need to stay calm. Don't do anything stupid." I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. "I won't, but I want him to pay." Nick sighed. "We'll make sure he does. Give me a few hours. I'll call you back." I hung up, feeling a strange mix of anger and hope. This wasn't going to end today, but I had a plan. I was going to take everything Greg valued, everything he thought he had under control, and I was going to destroy it piece by piece. As I walked back to the house, I thought about Lisa. She hadn't come after me. She didn't even try to explain herself. Was she too ashamed? Or worse, did she just not care? Either way, this wasn't over. I opened the door to find Nathan still playing, completely unaware of the storm brewing around him. For his sake, I had to stay strong. I had to be calm. But inside, I was already plotting the downfall of the man who had humiliated me in my own home. After that phone call with Nick, I felt like I had a direction. It wasn't much, but it was something to focus on instead of the chaos in my mind. I needed to keep my head clear if I was going to take Greg down. But first, I had to deal with Lisa. I couldn't avoid her forever, and part of me needed answers, even if I wasn't ready to hear them. I put Nathan to bed that night, reading him his favorite story. I couldn't let him feel the tension between his mom and me. He was still too young to understand what was happening, and I wanted to shield him from the ugliness for as long as I could. Once he was asleep, I knew I couldn't stall anymore. I walked down the hall to our bedroom. The door was slightly ajar, and I could see Lisa sitting on the edge of the bed, her face buried in her hands. She hadn't said a word to me since I walked in on her and Greg. She didn't even try to apologize, and that silence was eating me alive. When I stepped into the room, she looked up. Her eyes were red like she'd been crying, but that didn't move me. She should be crying. She'd torn our family apart. She'd brought this on herself. "Rick," she started, her voice hoarse. "I don't even know what to say." I stood there, arms crossed, waiting. I wasn't going to make this easy for her. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I never wanted this to happen." I scoffed. "Never wanted it to happen? You're telling me you didn't plan this? How long has it been going on, Lisa? How many times have you lied to me, walked out of this house and gone to him?" Her eyes filled with tears, and she shook her head. "I didn't mean for it to happen. It just did." "Bullshit," I spat. "You don't accidentally end up in bed with your boss. You made choices, Lisa. You made choices to betray me and your son, so don't sit there and act like you had no control." She flinched at my words, but I didn't care. She needed to hear this. I needed her to understand the depth of what she had done. "It wasn't like that," she said, wiping her eyes. "It started with the long hours at work, all the late meetings, and he was there. I was stressed, Rick, and I know that doesn't excuse it, but I was so overwhelmed, and he took advantage of that." I shook my head, disgusted. "Took advantage? Or did you let him?" Silence filled the room. She didn't answer, and that silence said more than anything she could have said. "I don't know what to do," she whispered, her voice trembling. I've ruined everything, haven't I? I felt a wave of anger rise up again, but I pushed it down. Yeah, Lisa, you did. You've ruined this marriage and you've ruined the trust I had in you. But right now, I'm not just thinking about us. I'm thinking about Nathan. What's this going to do to him? At the mention of our son, her face crumpled. She broke down, sobbing uncontrollably. For a brief moment, I felt a pang of sympathy. She was still the mother of my child. But then I remembered what I had walked in on earlier, and that sympathy vanished. I didn't want to hurt him, she choked out between sobs. I never wanted this to happen. Stop saying that, I snapped, my voice louder than I intended. You keep saying you didn't want this, but you let it happen over and over again. You lied to me. You betrayed your family. So don't sit there and act like you're the victim. She didn't respond. She just cried, her shoulders shaking as if the weight of what she'd done had finally hit her. I stood there for a while, watching her, feeling nothing but anger and disgust. This woman, who I had loved for years, who I thought I knew inside and out, was now a stranger to me. I didn't even recognize her anymore. I'll stay in the guest room tonight, I finally said, my voice cold. We'll figure out what to do in the morning. As I turned to leave, I heard her whisper behind me, Rick, do you think you'll ever be able to forgive me? I stopped in my tracks, but I didn't turn around. After a long pause, I answered her with the only truth I had. I don't know. And with that, I left her alone in the dark, closing the door behind me. That night in the guest room, sleep didn't come easily. My mind was racing, replaying everything over and over again. Nathan's innocent question, Lisa's betrayal, and Greg's smug, condescending face. I stared at the ceiling, my thoughts a tangled mess of rage, pain, and humiliation. By the time the sun crept through the blinds, I had made my decision. I wasn't going to be the victim in this. Greg thought he was untouchable, but he had no idea who he was messing with. I got up early and made myself some coffee. Lisa was still upstairs, probably in bed, pretending to sleep or crying herself back to sleep. I didn't care. I had work to do. I called Nick again, hoping he had already started digging. He answered on the first ring. Hey, Rick, I've been looking into this guy Greg. He's got a few skeletons in his closet, but nothing earth-shattering yet. A couple of complaints from employees about workplace harassment, but none of them stuck. Seems like he's been careful. Not careful enough, I muttered. He's going to regret ever crossing me. Nick hesitated. Look, Rick, I get that you're pissed, but don't do anything that'll come back to bite you. We can get him, legally, but you need to keep your head straight. I rubbed my eyes, feeling the exhaustion creeping in. I know, Nick. I'm not planning on doing anything crazy, but I'm not going to let him walk away from this. I want to hit him where it hurts. Nick's voice softened. I'll help you. Just give me a little more time to gather everything I can. If he's screwing around at work, there's bound to be something we can use. Thanks, I said quietly, hanging up the phone. I knew Nick would come through. He always did. He was the smart one in the family, always 5 steps ahead. And now I needed that. I needed a plan. But I couldn't sit and wait for Nick's call. I had to keep moving, keep pushing forward. I started making a list in my head. I needed to look into Greg's company, see if there was anyone else who might have dirt on him. Maybe there were other women, or maybe there were business deals that didn't go as smoothly as Greg liked to pretend. Then I thought about Lisa. She'd been with Greg for a while now. How long, I still didn't know. But maybe she had more information about his shady dealings than she realized. The thought of confronting her again made my stomach churn. But I had to do it. She was part of this mess, whether I liked it or not. I found her in the kitchen later that morning, sitting at the table with a cup of tea, her face pale and drawn. She didn't look up when I walked in, and the silence between us was thick and suffocating. I pulled out a chair and sat across from her. We need to talk. She finally looked at me, her eyes red and swollen from crying. I know. Greg, I said, cutting straight to the point. How long? She blinked, confused. How long? What? How long have you been sleeping with him? My voice was ice cold, and I could see her flinch. She looked down, her hands trembling as she held her cup. A few months. A few months? I repeated, the anger rising again. You've been lying to me for months? She nodded, tears welling up again. It wasn't supposed to be like this, Rick. I never wanted to hurt you. I clenched my jaw, forcing myself to stay calm. But you did, and now you're going to help me fix it. Her eyes widened. What do you mean? You're going to tell me everything you know about Greg. His business, his personal life, everything. If there's anything I can use to take him down, you're going to tell me. She shook her head, her voice barely a whisper. Rick, I can't. You will. I interrupted, my tone leaving no room for argument. You owe me that much. She looked at me, her expression filled with guilt and fear. He's not a good man, Rick. He's done things, but I don't know all the details. He's kept me in the dark about a lot of his business dealings. I leaned forward, my eyes locked on hers. Then you're going to find out. Because if you don't help me, I'll make sure everyone knows about what you did. Nathan, your parents, our friends, I'll tell them everything. She gasped, her face draining of color. You wouldn't. Try me, I said coldly. You've already betrayed me. Don't think for a second that I won't do what I need to do. Lisa looked down, her hands shaking. I could see the conflict in her eyes, but I didn't care anymore. She had made her choice when she let Greg into our bed. Now she had to deal with the consequences. I'll see what I can find out, she whispered. Good, I said, standing up. We'll start there. As I walked out of the room, I felt a grim sense of satisfaction. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. I was going to make Greg pay, and if Lisa wanted to save herself, she was going to help me do it. The days that followed were tense, filled with awkward silences and sidelong glances between Lisa and me. She avoided me as much as possible, and when we did speak, it was short, emotionless exchanges about Nathan or the household. But she knew what was coming. I wasn't going to let this just blow over, and she wasn't off the hook. Not yet. I spent my time gathering as much information as I could about Greg. I started with what Nick had given me, a list of complaints and minor scandals that Greg had somehow wriggled out of, thanks to his high-priced lawyers. It was mostly stuff that got swept under the rug. Inappropriate comments to female employees, shady business deals that never saw the light of day. Nick was right. It wasn't enough to take him down, but it was a start. Meanwhile, Lisa had been quietly digging for me, though she avoided talking about it unless I brought it up. One night, after putting Nathan to bed, I confronted her again. I found her in the living room, sitting on the couch staring blankly at the TV. She didn't even look up when I sat next to her, but I wasn't here for small talk. What have you found out? I asked, keeping my tone flat, unemotional. Lisa sighed, rubbing her temples. Rick, I've been trying, but there's not much I can get my hands on. Greg doesn't talk about his business with me. He keeps it all private. I narrowed my eyes, feeling the frustration bubbling up again. There's gotta be something, Lisa. He's not untouchable. He's got skeletons, and we're going to find them. She bit her lip, looking like she wanted to argue, but then she sighed again and leaned back. There's one thing. I don't know if it's useful, but Greg's company, it's not as solid as it looks. I sat up, suddenly interested. What do you mean? She hesitated, like she wasn't sure if she should be telling me this. He's been struggling financially. He hides it well, but there are cracks. Some big clients pulled out recently because of how he handles things. Unethically. He's been trying to cover it up, but if it gets out, it could ruin him. Now we were getting somewhere. Can you get proof? I asked, my voice low. I don't know, I've heard him talk about it during phone calls, but I don't have anything concrete. He's very careful. I sat back thinking. If Greg's company was on shaky ground, all it would take was the right push to send it tumbling down. A few disgruntled clients, some whispers of unethical behavior. Maybe I didn't need a smoking gun. Maybe I just needed to light a few fires and watch him scramble. I looked at Lisa, who still seemed torn. Part of me wanted to feel sorry for her. She was clearly scared of what Greg might do if he found out she was feeding me information. But another part of me, the part that had seen her in our bed with that smug bastard, didn't care. She had made her bed and now she was going to lie in it, one way or another. "Find out more," I said, my voice hardening. "Whatever you can. We'll hit him where it hurts." She nodded, but I could tell she was holding back. There was still something she wasn't telling me. "Lisa," I said, my tone softening slightly. "What else?" "You look like you've got something on your mind." She hesitated again, then finally met my eyes. "There's something else, but I didn't think it was relevant." I leaned in, my patience wearing thin. "Tell me." She took a deep breath. "Greg's wife. They're not as happy as they seem. She knows about his affairs. I've seen texts, overheard conversations. She's planning to leave him, and she's got a lot of dirt on him." I sat back, stunned. Greg's wife knew. This was better than I expected. "You think she'd be willing to help?" I asked, the wheels already turning in my mind. "I don't know. She's been keeping it quiet for now, but she's been gathering information for a while. If she leaves him, she could take him for everything." Now this was the kind of leverage I needed. If Greg's wife was already planning to blow up his life, I just needed to push things along, make sure it happened faster. "Find out more," I said again, my voice calm but firm. "Talk to her if you can. We need to know what she's got." Lisa nodded, clearly uncomfortable with where this was heading, but she didn't argue. She knew she didn't have a choice. As I stood up to leave the room, I glanced back at her. Part of me still couldn't believe that this was my life now, that the woman I had once trusted with everything was now helping me destroy another man. But I wasn't going to let the past hold me back. This wasn't about saving my marriage anymore. This was about payback. Greg had humiliated me, taken something from me that I could never get back. Now, I was going to take everything from him. And with his wife on my side, it was only a matter of time before his perfect little empire came crashing down. A week passed, and I could feel the tension building, both in my house and in my mind. Lisa had been quieter than usual, going through the motions of daily life, but there was a weight between us now, a ticking clock that we both knew would run out soon. I didn't know if I could ever forgive her for what she had done, but right now, I needed her help. Greg's wife, Megan, had become the key. If she was already gathering evidence, then it was just a matter of time before Greg's world started unraveling. I needed to make sure that when it did, I was the one pulling the strings. Lisa's connection to Megan was my way in, and I was determined to use it. It was late one evening when Lisa finally came to me with more information. I was sitting in the guest room, going over some documents Nick had sent me about Greg's company, when she knocked on the door. "Can I come in?" she asked softly, standing in the doorway. I nodded, gesturing for her to sit down. I didn't trust her, but I needed to keep the lines of communication open if we were going to take Greg down. "I talked to Megan," Lisa said, her voice quiet. "She's ready to leave him. She's just waiting for the right moment." "And?" I asked, my tone sharp. "Does she have anything we can use?" Lisa hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, she's got records, emails, texts, even some financial documents that prove Greg's been cooking the books for years. If this gets out, his company will be done." My heart raced. This was it, the proof I needed. Greg wasn't just a cheating scumbag, he was a criminal, and now I had the means to expose him. "Can she give us copies?" I asked, leaning forward. "We need to get our hands on that evidence." "She's scared," Lisa said, looking down at her hands. "She's afraid of what Greg will do if he finds out she's been collecting all this. But I think she's willing to meet. She wants out, Rick. She's done with him." I nodded, thinking. We need to make this airtight. If we push too hard, Greg will come after us. But if we do this right, he'll be too busy trying to save his company to come after anyone. Lisa looked at me, her eyes full of uncertainty. "Do you really think this will work?" I stared at her, trying to keep the anger from rising to the surface. It has to. A few days later, Lisa arranged the meeting with Megan. It was in a quiet cafe on the other side of town, far away from anyone who might recognize us. I was nervous, but I masked it behind a wall of determination. This was the moment everything started to come together. When we arrived, Megan was already sitting at a table in the back corner. She was younger than I expected, maybe in her mid-30s, with long dark hair and sharp eyes that darted around nervously as we approached. "Megan?" I asked as I sat down, extending my hand. She shook it, her grip firm despite the obvious tension in her face. "Rick, I've heard a lot about you." I shot a glance at Lisa, but she avoided my eyes. "I'm sure you have," I said, keeping my voice low. "Let's get to the point. You've got information that can take Greg down. I want it." Megan didn't hesitate. "I do. And I want him to pay for what he's done. But I need to know that you're not going to screw me over. I can't be left standing alone when this all goes down." I nodded, understanding her fear. "I'm not here to hurt you, Megan. I'm here to make sure Greg gets what he deserves. But I need that proof. Once we have it, we can take it to the right people, and Greg won't know what hit him." Megan's hand shook slightly as she reached into her bag and pulled out a small flash drive. She placed it on the table, her eyes locking onto mine. "This has everything: emails, financial records, text messages. It's enough to destroy him." I picked up the drive, my heart pounding in my chest. "You sure about this?" She nodded. "I've been gathering this for months. I was waiting for the right moment. And now, I don't care anymore. I just want out." I looked at Lisa, who had been quiet the entire time. This wasn't just about Greg anymore. This was about tearing apart the life she had chosen over me. A small part of me felt a flicker of satisfaction, knowing that everything was about to blow up in their faces. "We'll make sure he's ruined," I said, my voice firm. "But you need to be careful, Megan. Once Greg realizes what's happening, he'll come after anyone who stands in his way." She nodded, her expression grim. "I know, that's why I'm leaving. I've already got plans to disappear once this goes public." I slid the flash drive into my pocket, standing up to leave. "I'll be in touch," I said, offering her a final nod before walking out of the cafe. Back at home, I sat at my desk, staring at the flash drive in my hand. This was it. Everything I needed to burn Greg's life to the ground. But now, I had to decide how far I was willing to go. Nick had been helping me behind the scenes, but I knew this was bigger than just a legal battle. This was personal. Greg had humiliated me, taken everything I held dear, and now I had the power to destroy him. But revenge comes at a cost, and I wasn't sure how much I was willing to pay. As I plugged the flash drive into my computer, I took a deep breath, preparing myself for what I was about to see. The files opened, one after another, emails detailing backroom deals, records of money being moved through shell companies, texts between Greg and other women, including Lisa. I felt a fresh wave of anger as I scrolled through the texts, but I pushed it down. This wasn't about my marriage anymore. It was about getting justice. The evidence was all there, laid out in front of me. Greg was going down, and there was no way he could talk his way out of this one. All I had to do now was decide when to make my move. As I stared at the screen, a grim smile crossed my face. Greg had no idea what was coming. The next morning, I sat at my desk, staring at the flash drive. It felt heavier than it should, like it carried the weight of everything I had been through in the past few weeks. I had spent most of the night reviewing the evidence. Each file was another nail in Greg's coffin. But now, I had to figure out how to bring him down without getting dragged into the mess myself. I called Nick again. He was the only person I trusted to help me navigate this. After a few rings, he picked up, sounding groggy. "Hey, Rick, what's going on?" "I've got it," I said, cutting straight to the point. "All the proof we need to ruin Greg." There was a pause on the other end before Nick's voice sharpened. "You sure?" "I'm sure. Financial records, emails, everything. His whole business is a fraud, and if this gets out, he's done." Nick was quiet for a moment, then he sighed. "All right. We need to be careful with this. If you just dump all this out there, Greg's lawyers will bury you. We've got to play it smart." "I'm not trying to go public yet," I said. "I just want to make sure he knows what's coming. I want him to feel it before everything falls apart." Nick chuckled darkly. "You've always been the patient type. What's the plan?" "I'm going to start small. Leak a few things here and there, enough to make him sweat. Once he starts scrambling, we'll hit him with everything." Nick's voice was cautious. "Just remember, Rick, this isn't a game. Greg's not going to go down easy. He's going to fight back, and if he realizes you're behind it, he won't stop until he destroys you." I clenched my jaw. "I know, but I don't care anymore. I'm not backing down." Nick sighed again. "All right, send me what you've got, and I'll start working on the legal side. We'll make sure everything's airtight before we make any moves." I hung up the phone, feeling a sense of calm wash over me. The plan was in motion now. Greg had no idea what was coming, but he was about to find out. Later that afternoon, I sent an anonymous tip to a few key clients Greg had been working with. Just enough information to make them nervous. Details about his unethical practices, the shady financial dealings I had uncovered. I didn't include everything, but it was enough to get their attention. By the end of the day, I had heard from one of Nick's contacts in the legal world. The clients were starting to pull out. Greg's company was losing money, and fast. It wouldn't be long before the cracks started showing. I could imagine the panic setting in for Greg, the realization that his carefully constructed empire was beginning to crumble. But this was only the beginning. The next day, I received a call from Lisa. I hadn't spoken to her since the meeting with Megan, and part of me didn't want to answer, but I knew I couldn't avoid her forever. I picked up the phone, keeping my tone cold and distant. "What?" "Rick, something's happening. Greg's been in a panic all day. He thinks someone's trying to sabotage his company." I felt a grim sense of satisfaction. "Good." "Rick, listen," she said, her voice trembling. "He's starting to suspect me. He's been asking questions about whether I've talked to anyone. He knows something's going on." I wasn't surprised. Greg was smart, and he'd probably figured out by now that someone close to him was feeding information to his enemies. But I wasn't about to let Lisa off the hook. "Maybe you should have thought about that before you slept with him," I said coldly. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When Lisa spoke again, her voice was barely a whisper. "I know I screwed up, Rick, but please, I don't want to get caught up in this. If Greg finds out I helped you, I don't know what he'll do." I didn't respond right away. Part of me wanted to let her suffer, let her deal with the fallout of her own choices. But the other part of me knew that I couldn't afford to lose my inside connection just yet. "I'll handle Greg," I finally said. "Just keep feeding me whatever information you can. If he starts doing anything that looks desperate, I need to know." "Okay," she said, relief flooding her voice. "I'll keep you updated." I hung up, not bothering to say goodbye. I didn't have time for Lisa's guilt or her fear. I was focused on one thing, making sure Greg paid for everything he had done. By the end of the week, things had escalated. More clients were pulling out, and rumors were starting to spread within Greg's company. His employees were getting nervous, and the cracks in his empire were starting to show. But it wasn't enough. I needed to go further, to make sure Greg couldn't claw his way out of this. That's when I decided to meet with one of his competitors. Nick had a contact at a rival company, someone who had been circling Greg's business for years, waiting for the right moment to strike. I set up a meeting in a quiet bar on the outskirts of town. It was late and the place was nearly empty when I walked in. The man I was meeting, a sharp, well-dressed executive named Tom, was already sitting at a corner booth, nursing a whiskey. "You must be Rick," he said as I approached, standing to shake my hand. "Nick told me you might have something for me." I sat down across from him, sliding the flash drive across the table. "Everything you need to bring Greg down is on there. His business is bleeding clients and he's desperate. This is your chance to take him out." Tom raised an eyebrow, picking up the flash drive and turning it over in his hand. "What's your angle in all this?" I met his gaze, my voice steady. "Greg made it personal. I'm just making sure he pays for it." Tom smirked, pocketing the drive. "I can respect that. Don't worry, Rick. If what's on here is as good as you say, Greg won't last long." I nodded, feeling a sense of finality wash over me. This was it. The final blow. Greg wouldn't see it coming. As I walked out of the bar, I felt lighter than I had in weeks. Greg's empire was collapsing, and soon he'd have nothing left. But as I drove home that night, a thought crept into my mind. Once Greg was destroyed, what would be left for me? I had spent so much time focused on revenge that I hadn't thought about what came after. I pushed the thought aside. I'd worry about that later. For now, all that mattered was that Greg was finally going to pay. I woke up the next morning with a strange sense of calm. Greg's destruction was now inevitable, and for the first time in weeks I felt like I was in control. But there was still that nagging question in the back of my mind. What would happen after it was all over? I pushed it aside, focusing on the task at hand. There was still work to do. I got a call from Nick early that morning. "It's happening, Rick. Word's getting out. The clients we leaked info to have already started distancing themselves from Greg, and his stock's plummeting. I give it a few days before the media gets wind of it." I could hear the excitement in his voice, but I kept my own emotions in check. "Good," I said. "We're almost there." "There's something else," Nick added, his tone shifting. "Greg's starting to make moves, desperate ones. He's reaching out to his lawyers, trying to plug the leaks, but it's too late for that. He's going to start lashing out soon, Rick. You need to be ready." "I'm ready," I replied. But even as I said it, I couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to spiral out of control. That afternoon, I decided to pay a visit to Greg's office. Not to confront him, not yet, but to watch as everything fell apart around him. I wanted to see the panic in his eyes, to see him lose control of the empire he had built by stepping on others. I wanted to witness the man who had humiliated me crumble. I walked into the sleek office building where Greg's company was headquartered, my heart pounding with anticipation. The receptionist glanced up at me with a forced smile, but I could see the tension in her eyes. She knew something was wrong. Everyone did. "I'm here to see Greg Johnson," I said, my voice calm. "Do you have an appointment?" she asked, her fingers hesitating over the keyboard. "I'm an old friend," I replied, leaning on the counter slightly. "Just tell him Rick wants to chat." She looked uncertain, but after a moment she picked up the phone and called Greg's office. After a hushed conversation, she put the phone down and nodded. "You can go up. His office is on the top floor." I smirked. Of course it was. Greg always liked to look down on everyone. I took the elevator up, my mind racing. I hadn't prepared what I was going to say. Maybe I didn't need to say anything at all. Just showing up, knowing he couldn't do anything to stop what was coming, might be enough. When I stepped off the elevator and into the reception area outside Greg's office, I could feel the tension thick in the air. His assistant, a woman in her early 30s with a tight smile, waved me through without a word. She knew better than to stop me now. Greg's office door was slightly ajar, and I could hear him on the phone inside. His voice was louder than usual, sharp with panic. I stepped in without knocking, standing just inside the doorframe. Greg didn't see me at first. He was pacing behind his massive mahogany desk, his phone pressed to his ear, barking orders at someone on the other end. "I don't care what it costs, just fix it. We can't afford to lose another client or we're done. Do you hear me? Find out who's behind this and shut them down." I leaned against the doorframe, watching him unravel. When he finally turned and saw me standing there, his face froze. He slowly lowered the phone from his ear, his eyes narrowing. "Well, well," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "If it isn't the man of the hour." I didn't respond, just kept my eyes locked on his. He knew. He had to know. Greg slammed the phone down on his desk, crossing the room toward me. "You think you're smart, don't you?" he hissed, his face inches from mine. "You think you can ruin me?" I smirked. "Looks like you're doing a good job of that on your own." For a split second, I thought he was going to hit me. His fists clenched, his jaw tightened, and I could see the barely contained fury in his eyes. But he didn't. Instead, he turned his back to me, pacing again. "You don't know what you're dealing with, Rick," he muttered. "You have no idea how deep this goes. If you think you can just waltz in here and tear down everything I've built, you're out of your mind." I crossed my arms, leaning casually against the wall. "Funny, I was just thinking the same thing about you. Except you didn't just try to tear down a business, Greg. You tried to tear down my family." He stopped, turning to face me again, his expression dark and unreadable. "It was never personal, Rick." "Not personal?" I snapped, finally letting the anger break through. "You slept with my wife, Greg. You made it personal the second you stepped into my house." Greg's lips twisted into a bitter smile. "You think you're the first husband she's cheated on? Lisa was mine long before you came into the picture." I felt the blood rush to my face, and it took every ounce of control I had not to lunge at him. But I couldn't give him that satisfaction. This wasn't about beating him down physically. This was about taking everything he valued, piece by piece. "You're done, Greg," I said, my voice low but firm. "Your business, your reputation, everything is about to come crashing down, and you're not going to be able to stop it." Greg laughed, a harsh, mocking sound that echoed through the room. "You think you're the first person who's tried to bring me down? I've survived worse than you. You're just a bump in the road." I took a step closer, meeting his gaze. "We'll see about that." For a moment, we just stood there, locked in a silent battle of wills. Greg's face was twisted with anger, but I could see the fear creeping in around the edges. He knew he was losing control, and for the first time in my life, I felt like I was winning. Finally, Greg broke the silence, his voice cold and calculated. "I'll find out who's behind this, and when I do, you'll regret ever coming after me." I smiled, turning to leave. "Good luck with that." As I walked out of Greg's office, I felt a sense of finality wash over me. The battle lines were drawn. He would fight back, I knew that. But this time, I had the upper hand. His empire was crumbling, and there was no way he could stop it. When I reached the elevator, I glanced back at his office one last time. Greg might have thought he was invincible, but everyone has a breaking point, and I was going to make sure he hit his. The next few days felt like a storm gathering on the horizon. Greg's world was collapsing, just as I had planned. News of his shady business practices had started leaking to the media, and his clients were running for the exits. Every morning, I woke up to new headlines, each one dragging Greg's name further through the mud. Lisa had kept her distance since our last conversation. I think she knew that no matter what happened with Greg, our marriage was over. She'd made her choice and I'd made mine. I wasn't going to fight for something that had already died. Nick called me on a Thursday afternoon with the final piece of the puzzle. "Rick, it's done. Greg's being investigated. The SEC is involved now. They're going to tear through his books. By the time this is over, he'll be lucky if he's not in prison." I felt a surge of satisfaction. This was the moment I'd been waiting for. Greg was finished, but there was one last thing I needed to do. That evening, I made my way back to Greg's office building, my heart pounding in my chest. This time, I wasn't going there to gloat or trade words. I was going there to watch him break. When I arrived, the building was eerily quiet. Greg's receptionist was gone, and his office door was wide open. Inside, I found him sitting at his desk, staring blankly at a stack of papers. He looked different now, hollow, defeated. The arrogant man I'd seen days before was gone. I stepped inside, but Greg didn't even look up. "You won," he muttered, his voice flat. "Is that what you wanted to hear?" I stood there for a moment, letting the silence hang between us. "I didn't do this just to win, Greg. I did this to make sure you could never hurt anyone else the way you hurt me." Greg finally looked up, his eyes bloodshot and empty. "Everything's gone," he said quietly. "My company, my marriage, everything." I didn't feel the satisfaction I expected. Instead, I felt nothing. This man, who had once humiliated me, had lost everything. But standing there, I realized I had too. I nodded, turning to leave. "Now you know how it feels." As I walked out of Greg's office for the last time, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. The revenge I'd sought was complete, but I knew it hadn't fixed anything. Greg was ruined, but I still had to face what came next. The days after Greg's downfall were a blur. The media frenzy around his company hit full force, and his fall from grace became a headline on every business channel. Investigators dug deeper, and with the evidence Megan had provided, it was only a matter of time before Greg faced criminal charges. I thought that watching it all unfold would bring me peace, but instead, I felt hollow. My revenge was complete, but it hadn't brought back what I lost. The damage was done, not just to Greg, but to my life as well. Lisa and I barely spoke. Nathan was too young to understand the storm raging around him, and for that I was grateful. I tried my best to shield him from the tension in the house, but there was no hiding what had happened between his mom and me. The walls of our marriage were beyond repair. One evening, I sat Lisa down at the kitchen table. She looked exhausted, like she had aged 10 years in just a few weeks. I took a deep breath, knowing what had to be done. "This isn't going to work anymore, Lisa," I said quietly. "You know that." She nodded, her eyes filled with regret. "I know, Rick. I've known for a while." "I'm going to file for divorce," I said, my voice steady but emotionless. "We need to do what's best for Nathan. We can't pretend anymore." Tears filled her eyes, but she didn't argue. There was nothing left to say. We both knew that the love we once had was gone. All that remained were the pieces of what we used to be. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I never meant for it to end like this." I nodded, though I wasn't sure if I could accept her apology. "Take care of Nathan. That's all that matters now." In the weeks that followed, I filed for divorce. It was painful, but it was the right thing to do. Lisa moved out and we agreed on shared custody for Nathan. The house felt emptier without her, but I knew that this was the path we had to take. As for Greg, the last I heard, he was facing criminal charges and bankruptcy. Megan had left him, taking everything she could in the divorce. He was a broken man, and while I didn't feel sorry for him, I realized that revenge hadn't given me the closure I thought it would. One night, as I sat alone in the house, Nathan fast asleep upstairs, I looked out the window and thought about everything that had happened. I had spent so much time consumed by anger, by the need to make Greg pay, that I hadn't stopped to think about what I really wanted. Peace. Maybe that peace would come in time. Maybe it wouldn't. But for now, I knew I had to start rebuilding. Not for me, but for Nathan. He deserved a father who wasn't trapped in the past, who wasn't defined by betrayal and revenge. I stood up, walked to Nathan's room, and watched him sleep for a moment. This was my new beginning. It wasn't perfect, but it was mine, and that was enough.